The unforgiving Texas sun beats down on a land stained with grief and grit. For a lone widow named Elspeth Monroe, survival is a daily war waged against the dust and the silence left by her husband's death. Her son William is all she has left, a boy trying to fill boots too big for him, his stomach aching with a hunger she can no longer ignore. But when a shadow falls across her doorway, it's not the salvation she prayed for. It is a Comanche warrior, a man whose people her own have fought and feared for generations. He carries a desperate infant in his arms and makes a proposal that defies every law of her world, a bargain of flesh and blood that will either save them all or shatter what little remains of her life. The silence was the loudest thing on the Monroe homestead. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a prairie evening. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket woven from the absence of Thomas Monroe's booming laugh and the rhythmic clang of his hammer. For 6 months, Elspeth had lived with it, breathed it in with the fine red dust that coated everything she owned. It settled in the lines around her eyes and in the hollows of her heart. Her world had shrunk to the 4 walls of the sturdy but lonely cabin Thomas had built with his own hands and the vast, indifferent expanse of the Texas panhandle that stretched out from her porch. It was a land of cruel beauty, where the sunsets painted the sky in strokes of violent orange and purple, but the daylight hours revealed a parched earth that offered little comfort and even less sustenance. Her son William sat at the rough-hewn table, his small hands turning over a whittling knife that had been his father's. At 11 years old, he had the serious, pinched face of an old man. The lanky, carefree boy who used to chase jackrabbits through the tall grass was gone, replaced by a somber child, burdened with a responsibility he was not ready for. He was trying to mend a leather strap for the water pail, his brow furrowed in concentration, his movements clumsy and uncertain. Every failed task, every splintered piece of wood was another reminder of the man they had lost. "It's no good, Ma," he finally said, his voice a low murmur that barely disturbed the oppressive quiet. He pushed the strap away, the frustration clear in the slump of his shoulders. Pa would have had this fixed in a minute. Elspeth turned from the near-empty flour bin, forcing a smile that felt like cracking clay. "You're doing just fine, William. Your father didn't learn it all in a day, either." But they didn't have days. They had what was left in the larder, a handful of flour, half a sack of beans, and a few jars of preserved peaches that felt more like a memory of sweetness than a source of nourishment. The deer had moved to higher ground, the rabbits were scarce, and William's attempts to hunt with his father's heavy rifle had resulted in nothing but wasted ammunition and a deepening sense of failure. He knew how to track in theory. Thomas had shown him the basics, a broken twig here, a scuff mark there. But reading the land was a language, and William was still learning the alphabet, while starvation was writing the final chapter. That afternoon, the heat was a physical presence shimmering above the baked earth. Elspeth was patching one of William's shirts, her needle moving with a practiced, weary rhythm, when a new shadow fell through the open doorway. It wasn't the familiar shadow of the lone cottonwood tree or the passing of a cloud. This one was tall, solid, and utterly still. She looked up, her heart lurching into her throat. A man stood there, framed by the blinding sunlight. He was Comanche. There was no mistaking the proud, hawk-like cast of his features, the twin braids of gloss-black hair that fell over his bare chest, or the intricate beadwork on his deerskin leggings. He wasn't a warrior in paint, not a spectre of violence she'd heard whispered about in Redemption Creek. He was just a man, but a man from a world that was supposed to be her enemy. In his arms, held with a tenderness that seemed at odds with the raw power of his frame, was a swaddled bundle. William scrambled to his feet, instinctively reaching for the old rifle mounted above the fireplace. The man's dark eyes flickered towards the boy, but he made no threatening move. His gaze was ancient and exhausted, filled with a sorrow that transcended language. "Do not be afraid," he said, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. His English was clear-accented but precise. "I do not come for war." Elspeth rose slowly, placing herself between the stranger and her son. Her own fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but she would not show it. She was Thomas Monroe's widow, and this was his home. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. The warrior took a step forward, just out of the harsh glare of the sun. Now she could see the fine lines of fatigue etched around his eyes and mouth. He looked down at the bundle in his arms, and his expression softened with a pain so profound it was almost tangible. He gently adjusted the thin blanket, revealing the tiny red-faced infant within. A girl. My wife. She walked the spirit road 3 nights ago. He said the words, costing him a visible effort. The birth. It took her from me. This is my daughter. Elspeth's heart gave a painful throb of empathy. She knew that loss. She knew the hollowing out of the soul that came with watching a loved one slip away. The animosity she had been conditioned to feel flickered, replaced by the shared, universal grief of a survivor. "I'm sorry for your loss," she managed to say the words, feeling small and inadequate. The warrior nodded a brief, sharp gesture of acknowledgement. He looked from his sleeping daughter to William, who still stood rigid by the fireplace, his knuckles white on the rifle stock. Then his gaze intense and unnervingly direct settled on Elspeth. He took another deliberate step into the cabin. The air grew thick with unspoken meaning. He held her gaze for a long moment, a silent plea passing between them, before he ever spoke the words. The words that would tear her world apart for a second time. "Your son is thin," the warrior stated not as an insult, but as a simple, brutal fact. "He does not know the way of the hunter. The deer and the buffalo speak a language he has not learned. I can teach him. I will fill your smokehouse with meat for the winter." He paused, letting the offer settle in the stifling air. He then looked down at his newborn daughter, her tiny mouth making sucking motions in her sleep. "My daughter," he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, laden with a father's desperate love, requires breastfed. She will die without it. He looked up, and Elspeth felt the full weight of his impossible world-altering request. It was a trade. A life for a life, a future for a future. Your son needs to learn how to hunt. My daughter requires breastfed. The Comanche's words hung in the air heavier and more potent than the dust motes dancing in the slanted afternoon light. Elspeth stared at him, her mind a maelstrom of shock, revulsion, and a terrifying sliver of understanding. Every instinct, every lesson taught by her preacher father, every cautionary tale whispered by the women in town screamed at her to refuse. To take the rifle from William and drive this man, this savage, from her home. He was asking her to perform the most intimate act of motherhood for the child of an enemy. To give the sustenance of her own body, a body that had only ever nursed her own son, to a Comanche baby. The thought was a violation, a sacrilege against the memory of her husband and the sanctity of her home. "No," she said, the word coming out as a sharp, breathless gasp. "Absolutely not. You need to leave. Now." The warrior did not flinch. His expression remained one of grim, unyielding sorrow. He seemed to have expected her refusal, yet it did not deter him. He simply stood there, a granite statue of paternal desperation, the sleeping infant, a fragile counterpoint to his strength. "The child will not take the goat's milk. She weakens. Look at your boy. His eyes have the hunger of the wolf cub whose mother has gone. Winter is a hungry spirit. It will not care that his father is gone. It will only care that his belly is empty. His words were arrows, each one finding its mark in the softest parts of her fear. He was right. She saw it every time William looked at the last of the salted pork, his pride warring with the gnawing emptiness in his stomach. She saw it in the way his clothes hung more loosely on his thinning frame. Thomas had been a good provider, a smart rancher, but he had been taken from them before he could pass on all his knowledge. He had taught William how to be a good boy, but he hadn't had time to teach him how to be a man in a land that devoured boys. "Get out," she repeated, her voice trembling now. "I'll not have you speak of my son." William, emboldened by his mother's defiance, finally lifted the rifle. It was too heavy for him, the barrel wavering. "You heard her. Go on, get." The Comanche's gaze shifted to William, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than sorrow crossed his face. It might have been pity. A brave warrior does not point his weapon unless he means to use it. And you, boy, do not have the heart to use it. Not yet. He looked back at Elspeth. "My name is Kono. My daughter is called Papina. It means morning dove. She deserves to see a morning." With that, he turned his movements fluid and silent and stepped back out into the blinding sun, leaving the shadows in the cabin feeling colder and deeper than before. Elspeth rushed to the door, barring it shut with a shaking hand, her back pressed against the rough wood, as if she could physically hold his proposal at bay. For 2 days, Elspeth tried to erase the encounter. She and William ate sparingly their meals, quiet, strained affairs. She tried to teach William how to set snares, but the rabbits were too clever. On the 3rd day, William took the rifle, a look of grim determination on his face. "I saw tracks down by the creek ma, a doe and her fawn. I can do it." She didn't have the heart to stop him. She watched him go, his shoulders set with a fragile bravado that broke her heart. She spent the day praying, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. The hours stretched into an eternity. Late in the afternoon, she heard him coming. It wasn't the triumphant return of a hunter. It was a stumbling, painful shuffle. He limped into the cabin, his face pale and streaked with dirt and tears of frustration. His trousers were torn at the knee, a bloody gash underneath. "I slipped on the rocks," he mumbled, avoiding her eyes. "I startled her. The doe. I fired. I missed. I think I just scared her. The kick from the gun. It knocked me back." He finally looked at her, his composure crumbling. "I can't do it, Ma, I can't. We're going to starve, and it's my fault." He collapsed into a chair and sobbed the raw, heartbroken cries of a child who had tried and failed to be a man. Elspeth knelt and held him, stroking his hair, her own tears mingling with his. In that moment, holding her hungry, injured son, the warrior's words echoed in her mind. Winter is a hungry spirit. The walls of her prejudice, built of fear and tradition, began to crumble. What was her pride worth against her son's life? What was the judgment of the people in town worth compared to the gnawing hunger in William's belly? She looked at her son's tear-stained face, and then in her mind's eye she saw another face, the tiny sleeping infant in the arms of a grieving father. Papina, mourning dove. A baby who deserved to see a morning. Her decision was not a surrender. It was an act of war against the fate that threatened to consume them. It was the desperate, ferocious choice of a mother. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Elspeth saddled their mare, Bessie. She packed a small bundle with a clean cloth and a flask of water. "Where are you going?" Ma William asked, his voice hoarse from crying. "I'm going to fix this," she said, her voice imbued with a resolve that surprised even herself. "Stay inside. Bar the door. Don't open it for anyone." She rode out not towards Redemption Creek, but towards the low-lying hills where the Comanche sometimes made camp. She didn't know if she would find him. She only had a direction, a desperate hope. She scanned the horizon, her eyes searching for a wisp of smoke, a sign of life. After an hour, she saw it, a thin grey plume rising against the pale blue sky. She found his camp in a small sheltered cove, hidden by a cluster of mesquite trees. It was a simple temporary camp, a single tipiet's hide cover painted with symbols she didn't understand, and a small, smokeless fire. Kono was sitting by the fire, rocking his daughter, who was letting out a weak, mewling cry. He looked up as Elspeth approached his face, a mask of weary vigilance. He showed no surprise, only a deep, questioning stillness. Elspeth dismounted, her legs unsteady. She walked towards him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She stopped a few feet away, the crying of the infant tearing at her. The child, Elspeth said, her voice tight. "Is she?" "She is weak," Kono replied, his voice flat. "She will not last another night." Elspeth took a deep breath, the dry prairie air scorching her lungs. She had rehearsed a speech, a list of terms and conditions. But looking at the fading life in that tiny bundle, the words felt hollow and cruel. There was only the core of the bargain, stripped of all pretense. "I will do it," she said, the words falling like stones into the silence between them. Kono's stoic facade finally broke. A wave of profound relief washed over his features, so powerful it seemed to physically shake him. He closed his eyes for a moment, a silent prayer of thanks offered to a god she did not know. "But we have terms," Elspeth added, quickly regaining her composure. "This is a bargain. Nothing more. You will teach my son. You will fill my smokehouse. You will not bring your people to my land. You will be respectful of my home and my ways. And when the child is weaned, or when my son can provide for us, this arrangement is over. Do you understand?" Kono rose to his feet, the infant cradled against his chest. He looked at her, his dark eyes seeming to see straight into her soul past the fear and prejudice to the mother beneath. "You have my word," he said. "A warrior's word is his life." He took a hesitant step towards her and extended his arms, offering her his daughter. "Her name is Papina." Elspeth's hands trembled as she reached out. The baby was terrifyingly light, a fragile collection of bones wrapped in soft leather. Her skin was warm, her tiny face wrinkled and flushed. As Elspeth settled the infant into the crook of her arm, Papina's cries quieted. Her small mouth, like a blind bird, began to search for purchase. Looking down at this innocent alien child, Elspeth felt the last of her resistance melt away, replaced by a powerful primal instinct. This wasn't a Comanche baby. It was just a baby. A hungry child who needed a mother. And she, in her own desperate way, needed a hunter. The bargain of blood and milk had been struck. The first few days of the arrangement were a fragile truce, governed by an awkward, unspoken choreography. Kono did not enter her home again. He made a small, discreet camp by the creek at the edge of her property, a place where he could see the cabin, but keep a respectful distance. 3 times a day, with the rising sun at midday, and as twilight bled across the sky, he would walk to the cabin, Papina in his arms. He would knock softly on the doorframe and wait. Elspeth would take the baby, her movements efficient and detached, and retreat to the rocking chair Thomas had made for her when William was born. She would unbutton her dress, her back to the open door, a profound sense of shame and strangeness washing over her. She would not look at Kono, who stood silently at the threshold, a guardian watching over his precious cargo. She focused only on the child. Peppina was a ravenous infant, her tiny hands kneading at Elspeth's breast, her suckling strong and desperate. In those moments, the world shrank to the physical connection, the giving and receiving of life. It was a language older than words, older than tribes and borders. The child's warmth seeped into her, a strange comfort that she refused to acknowledge. When Peppina was fed, sleepy and content, Elspeth would swaddle her again and hand her back to Kono. A brief nod was their only communication before he would retreat to his camp. The lessons for William began on the second day. Kono arrived not with his daughter, but with 2 short, powerful bows and a quiver of arrows. He did not speak to Elspeth, but beckoned to William with a slight tilt of his head. William, full of apprehension and a reluctant excitement, followed him out onto the prairie. Elspeth watched from the window, her heart a tangled mess of anxiety and hope. Kono was not a gentle teacher. He didn't coddle or praise. He communicated with gestures, with demonstrations of silent perfection. He showed William how to stand, how to draw the bowstring, not with the strength of his arm, but with the power of his back. He made the boy hold the draw for minutes at a time, until his muscles screamed in protest. "The arrow is not a rock you throw," Kono told him, his voice low and firm. "It is a part of you, your breath, your eye, your arm. All must become one before you let it fly." He taught William to see the world differently, not as a landscape, but as a story. He pointed to the barely perceptible depression in the grass. "Deer. Last night. Heavy. A buck." He crumbled a pellet of dung between his fingers. "Still warm. He is close." He taught the boy to move, not like a clumsy farmer's son, but like a shadow, placing each foot with intention, his body low to the ground. Slowly, miraculously, William began to change. The sullen frustration that had clouded his face was replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. He stopped complaining about his chores. He rose earlier, practicing his stance with the bow until his fingers were raw. For the first time since his father's death, a light had returned to her son's eyes. He was learning a new language, the unspoken language of survival, and he was becoming fluent. A week into the arrangement, Kono brought the carcass of a large buck to the homestead. He'd killed it with a single perfectly placed arrow. He laid it near the porch without a word, and began to skin it, with a skill that was both brutal and beautiful. He gestured for William to watch, to learn. Later that evening, the smell of roasting venison filled the small cabin for the first time in months. The taste of fresh meat was rich and overwhelming. As Elspeth watched William eat, his hunger finally sated. A wave of gratitude, unwelcome and confusing, washed over her. She owed this man, this savage. She owed him her son's returning spirit and the food on their table. Her own relationship with Peppina was also changing, shifting from a clinical duty to something deeper. The baby was beginning to know her. Her dark, intelligent eyes would follow Elspeth around the room. She would quiet from her fussing the moment Elspeth held her. A tiny hand would curl around Elspeth's finger, a grip of absolute trust. Elspeth found herself humming old lullabies to the child, the same ones she had sung to William. She hated herself for it, for the softness that was creeping into her heart, a betrayal of the neat, sterile bargain she had tried to impose. One afternoon, as she was nursing Peppina, the baby let out a small burp and then smiled a gummy, milk-drunk grin. It was the first time. Without thinking, Elspeth smiled back, a genuine, unburdened smile that reached her eyes. Kono, standing at the doorway, saw it. Their eyes met over the head of the smiling infant, and in that shared moment, The wall between them became a little more transparent. He saw not a reluctant nurse, but a mother. She saw not a Comanche warrior, but a father. But their fragile, isolated world was about to be breached. Trouble, like a hawk circling, was gliding in from the direction of Redemption Creek. A cattleman named Jedediah Thorne had long coveted the Monroe's stretch of land for its access to the creek. Thomas had always rebuffed his lowball offers. With Thomas gone, Thorne had been circling, waiting for Elspeth to fail. He'd hired a man, a drifter named Finch, to keep an eye on the widow's place, to report back on how close she was to breaking. One evening, hidden in a cluster of rocks on a ridge overlooking the homestead, Finch watched with greedy eyes. He didn't see a starving widow. He saw a plume of smoke from a smokehouse. He saw a boy practicing with a bow and arrow with deadly new accuracy. And then he saw the most unbelievable sight of all, the Comanche warrior Kono, walking to the cabin and handing his infant child to the widow Monroe, who took it without hesitation. Finch scrambled back to his horse, a malicious grin spreading across his face. Oh, Jedediah Thorne would pay handsomely for this piece of news. This was better than starvation. This was scandal. This was damnation. And for Thorne, it would be the perfect weapon. The salt was running low. It was a simple, mundane fact, but one that filled Elspeth with a profound sense of dread. With the smokehouse now curing strips of venison, salt was a necessity, not a luxury. For 3 weeks she had managed to avoid Redemption Creek, living within the strange, self-contained world she had forged with Kono and William. But the homestead could not provide everything. She needed salt coffee and more flour if she was to bake bread to go with their meat. She saddled Bessie at dawn, her stomach churning, with an anxiety that had nothing to do with the risk of bandits or snakes. She was afraid of the whispers. She was afraid of the looks. Redemption Creek was a town built on a rigid UN-forgiving code. It was a place where conformity was safety, and anything out of the ordinary was a threat. "Be careful," Ma William said, standing by the porch. He held his bow no longer a clumsy toy, but an extension of his arm. Kono had given him a sense of purpose that also manifested as a fierce, protective instinct. "I will be," she promised, trying to sound more confident than she felt. As she rode, she saw Kono on a nearby rise, a silent, watchful sentinel. He didn't wave or call out, but she knew he was watching her, ensuring her safe passage off their land. The knowledge was both comforting and complicating. The moment she rode down Redemption Creek's dusty main street, she felt the change. The usual greetings and nods from familiar faces were absent. Doors that were normally open were suddenly closed. Mrs. Gable, the baker's wife, who always had a cheerful word, abruptly turned her back to inspect a sack of flour as Elspeth passed. The feeling of being watched was palpable, a hostile pressure on her skin. She tied Bessie in front of Henderson's mercantile, took a deep breath, and pushed open the door. The familiar smell of leather coffee and dry goods did little to soothe her nerves. The store was crowded, but a hush fell as she entered. All conversation ceased. All eyes turned to her. Mr. Henderson, a portly man with whom Thomas had shared many a drink, polished the counter with a vigor that was entirely for show. He refused to meet her gaze. "Good morning, Mr. Henderson." Elspeth said, her voice unnaturally loud in the silence. "I need 10 pounds of salt, 5 of flour, and a pound of coffee." He grunted, turning to weigh out the salt without a word. From the corner of the room, a low, grating voice cut through the tension. "Well, well, if it ain't the Comanche's wet nurse." The voice belonged to Jedediah Thorne. He was leaning against a stack of barrels, a smug, cruel smile on his face. He was a big man, running to fat, but with a core of meanness that made him dangerous. At his side was the rat-faced drifter Finch. Elspeth's face burned with humiliation. She ignored him, keeping her eyes fixed on the counter. "And the coffee, Mr. Henderson." Thorne chuckled a nasty, rumbling sound. "Here, tell you're keeping fine company out at your place, Elspeth. Real fine company. Must be comforting having a buck around to do a man's work for you." A few of the men in the store snickered. The women just stared their faces, a mixture of morbid curiosity and stern judgment. These were women she had prayed with in church, whose children she had helped watch. Now they looked at her, as if she were a disease. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice tight. "Oh, I think you do." Thorne pressed on, enjoying his power. "My man Finch here saw it all. You taking that little savage baby to your breast. It's unnatural is what it is. A disgrace to your husband's memory." The mention of Thomas was a knife twist. Tears pricked her eyes, but she fought them back with a surge of fury. She turned to face him, her chin high. "My husband's memory is my business. And how I choose to survive on the land he left me is also my business. It's certainly no concern of a vulture like you, Jedediah." Thorne's smile vanished, replaced by a dark scowl. "You watch your mouth, woman. People in this town, we look out for our own. But you ain't one of us anymore. You've chosen your side. You and your redskin lover." The word lover struck her like a physical blow. The accusation was so vile, so far from the stark reality of her arrangement with Kono, that she was momentarily stunned into silence. Mr. Henderson shoved her goods across the counter, finally meeting her eyes with a look that was a mixture of pity and fear. He wanted her gone. She was trouble. Elspeth threw her coins on the counter, grabbed her bags and walked out, her back straight, her ears ringing with the renewed buzz of whispers that erupted behind her. She untied Bessie with fumbling fingers, desperate to escape. As she mounted, Sheriff Bartlett stepped out of his office across the street. He was a man worn down by his job, his face a roadmap of compromises and hard choices. He walked towards her, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Monroe," he said, his voice low, "I'd like a word." "I've done nothing wrong, Sheriff," she said, her voice shaking with righteous anger. "Didn't say you had," he replied, stroking his mustache. "But folks are talking. Thorne is stirring up trouble, saying you've got a Comanche warrior living on your property. In this territory, with the raids we had last spring, that's like lighting a match in a barn full of dry hay. Is it true?" Elspeth hesitated. To admit it was to confirm their worst fears. To deny it was to lie. She chose a third option. "I am a widow alone with a young son. I am doing what is necessary to survive the winter. That is all." The sheriff sighed a long, weary sound. He looked at her, and for a moment she saw a glimmer of understanding in his tired eyes. "Just be careful, Elspeth. Thorne's a snake, and he's riled the nest. People are scared, and scared people do stupid things." She nodded, curtly nudged Bessie with her heels, and rode out of Redemption Creek, not looking back. The short journey home felt like crossing a desert. The town was no longer a place of potential help. It was a source of active danger. She was truly, utterly alone now, save for a boy learning to be a man and a stranger who was the source of both her salvation and her ruin. The whispers from the town were a poison, and she knew, with a cold certainty, that they would soon be carried on the wind to her front door. The whispers from town didn't just stay in town. They drifted out onto the prairie, carried by fear and malice, and they found fertile ground in the dark heart of Jedediah Thorne. He had seen the flash of defiance in Elspeth's eyes, and it had infuriated him. He had expected a broken, pliable widow, not a woman with a spine of steel. The public humiliation had failed to bend her. Now he would have to break her. His first move was subtle, designed to terrorize. A few nights after Elspeth's trip to town, she was awakened by the frantic whinnying of Bessie the mare. She and William rushed outside with a lantern. The corral gate was wide open, swinging eerily in the breeze. Bessie was gone. Panic seized Elspeth. The mare was their only transportation, their link to the outside world, however hostile it had become. They spent the next hour searching in the dark, calling her name, their voices swallowed by the vast, indifferent night. As dawn broke, they found her a mile away, her leg tangled in a poorly strung length of barbed wire that had never been there before. It wasn't a serious injury, but it was a clear message. You are vulnerable. We can get to you. Kono appeared as Elspeth was so carefully tending to the mare's leg. He surveyed the scene, his eyes missing nothing: the deliberately cut corral rope, the new wire, the tracks of a single-shod horse. He looked at Elspeth's pale, worried face. This was not an accident. He said, his voice a low growl. It was Thorn, she replied, her voice filled with a weary anger. He's trying to scare us off. Kono's jaw tightened. He walked to the place where the wire had been strung, knelt and examined the ground. He picked up something small and dark and brought it back to her. It was a half-smoked cheroot, a specific brand that Jedediah Thorn was known for. He will come again, Kono said. Fear is his weapon. When it does not work, he will use fire or guns. A new kind of fear, sharp and immediate, pierced through Elspeth's resolve. This was no longer about disapproval and whispers. This was about violence, about Thorn and his men riding down on her and William in the dead of night. The incident changed the dynamic on the homestead. Kono's presence became less of a distant arrangement and more of a necessary guardianship. He no longer waited at the threshold for Peppina, but would step just inside his gaze, sweeping the horizon from the doorway as Elspeth nursed the baby. He began teaching William more than just hunting. He taught him how to be watchful, how to listen to the sounds of the night, to distinguish the call of an owl from a man's imitation. One afternoon, as Kono was showing William how to fletch an arrow, he paused. He told the boy a story, a Comanche tale about a brave hawk who protected his nest from a cunning snake. The snake did not attack the hawk directly, but tried to steal its eggs one by one to weaken it, to make it abandon the nest. Thorn is the snake. Kono said, his eyes fixed on William. He takes your horse. He may poison your well or set fire to your grass. He wants you to feel that this place, your home, is no longer safe. He wants you to run. We won't run, William said, his voice fierce. This was Pa's land. Kono nodded, a rare expression of approval on his face. Good. Then we do not run. We become the hawk. A few days later, Elspeth was working in her small vegetable garden when Kono approached her. He was not there for Peppina. His face was unusually grim. We need to talk, he said. About your husband, Elspeth stiffened. What about him? The man Thorn, Kono said. He wanted this land before your husband died. Yes, she answered, wary. He made offers. Thomas always refused. Why, the day your husband died, Kono continued, his gaze intense. You told my boy it was a fall. His horse was spooked. That's right. A freak storm blew in. A bolt of lightning must have startled the horse. He was thrown against the rocks down by the canyon. Her voice trembled as she recounted the official story, the one Sheriff Bartlett had concluded was the only possibility. Kono was silent for a long moment. My people know the sky. There was no lightning storm that day. There was wind, yes, but no fire from the sky. Elspeth stared at him, her blood running cold. What are you saying? I was hunting near the canyon that day, Kono said softly. I saw your husband ride down. A little while later, 2 other men followed. One was the big man Thorn. The other was the one with the face of a weasel. Finch. Elspeth could barely breathe. You saw them, I saw them ride into the canyon. I heard a shout. It was a man's shout of anger, not fear. Then the horse came running out alone, its eyes wild. Thorn and the other man rode out a few minutes later. They rode fast, looking over their shoulders. They did not know I was hidden in the rocks, watching. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The story she had clung to, the tragic accident that had defined her life for 6 months, was a lie. Thomas hadn't been killed by a random act of nature. He had been murdered. Thorn hadn't just been an opportunistic vulture. He was the predator who had made the kill. The revelation was a fresh wave of grief, sharper and more terrible than the first, because this one was laced with the poison of injustice. Tears streamed down her face, hot and silent. All the pieces clicked into place: Thorn's relentless pressure, his immediate assumption that the land was his for the taking, his hatred for her defiance. He wasn't trying to scare off a widow, he was trying to finish a job. Kono stood before her, his presence a solid anchor in her swirling sea of shock and rage. He had not told her this to cause her pain, but to arm her with the truth. The shadow of the hawk had a name, and it was Jedediah Thorn. And Elspeth knew with a chilling certainty that the snake was coming back to strike at the nest, and this time he would aim to kill. Their bargain of milk and meat had become a pact for survival, an alliance against a murderer. The air grew heavy and cold in the days that followed Kono's revelation. A tense, watchful silence settled over the homestead. Every rustle of leaves, every distant coyote howl sent a jolt of adrenaline through Elspeth. They were no longer just waiting for winter. They were waiting for war. Kono moved his camp from the creek to a small, defensible copse of trees closer to the cabin. He spent his days training William not just with the bow, but with the knife, teaching him how to fight with desperate, close-quarters ferocity. He taught Elspeth how to reload Thomas's rifle quickly, how to brace it against her shoulder to absorb the punishing kick. Their strange partitioned lives had merged into one. They ate the evening meal together by the fire near Kono's tipi, a silent, grim council of 3, with Papina sleeping peacefully nearby, oblivious to the storm gathering around them. The full moon, what Kono called the hunter's moon, rose fat and silver in the night sky, bathing the prairie in an ethereal, ghostly light. He will come tonight, Kono said, his eyes scanning the moonlit horizon. He is a coward. He will think the light gives him the advantage of a hunter, but he does not know that it also reveals the prey to the hawk. They made their preparations. Elspeth barricaded the cabin door and windows, leaving only small slits to shoot through. William, his face pale, but his hand steady, took up a position in the darkened loft with his bow and a dozen sharp arrows, a commanding view of the yard below. Kono melted into the shadows outside a phantom of vengeance, armed with his own bow and a razor-sharp tomahawk. The waiting was the worst part. The minutes stretched into hours. Elspeth's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the night. Then they heard it. The soft thud of approaching horses, their riders trying and failing to be silent. A voice cut through the night, thick with arrogance. Elspeth Monroe, Jedediah Thorn. I know you're in there, you and your savage pet. We've come to reclaim this land for decent folk. Come on out and we'll make it quick. Elspeth peered through a slit in the cabin wall. She could see 4 of them. Thorn sat on his horse, like a bloated King Finch beside him. 2 other hired thugsmen she recognized as troublemakers from town fanned out their rifles ready. This is my home, Jedediah, she shouted back, her voice shaking but clear. You're the one who's trespassing. You're a murderer. A cold, deadly silence followed her accusation. Thorn's laughter, when it came, was strained. Crazy talk from a crazy woman. You've been out in the sun too long. Last chance. Come out never fine. Thorn snarled. Burn her out. One of the thugs dismounted a torch in his hand that he'd lit from a lantern. He started walking towards the cabin, the flames casting flickering, monstrous shadows. The first sound was a soft thwip from the darkness, almost lost in the chirping of the crickets. The man with the torch stopped dead. He looked down, a puzzled expression on his face, at the arrow shaft protruding from his chest. He crumpled to the ground without a sound. Chaos erupted. Where did that come from? Finch shrieked, his horse dancing nervously. Another arrow, this one from the hayloft, flew through the air. It struck Thorn's remaining thug in the shoulder, sending him yelling and cursing as he dropped his rifle. It wasn't a killing shot, but it was William's shot. From her position below, Elspeth felt a surge of fierce, terrifying pride. Her son was a hunter now. Thorn and Finch dove from their horses, taking cover behind a water trough. He's in the barn. Thorn roared, firing his pistol wildly at the loft. Splinters flew from the wood near William's head. Elspeth steadied her own rifle, aimed carefully, as Kono had shown her, and fired. The shot went wide, but it served its purpose, forcing Thorn to duck and giving William time to scramble to a safer position. From the shadows, Kono moved. He was not a man anymore. He was a spirit of the night, swift and silent. He circled around behind the wounded thug who was trying to pull the arrow from his shoulder. A blur of motion, a single sharp cry, and the man was silent. Now it was just Thorn and Finch. They were pinned down behind the trough, terrified. "This ain't worth it," Jed Finch whined, his voice high with panic. "Let's get out of here." "Shut up," Thorn hissed. He knew he couldn't escape. Kono was out there somewhere, a ghost with a bow, and the cabin held at least 2 more guns. His gamble had failed spectacularly. "Give it up," Thorn, Elspeth yelled. "It's over." Fueled by rage and desperation, Thorn did something foolish. He burst from behind the trough, firing his pistol at the dark shape he thought was Kono. The shots went wild. It was the opening Kono needed. He rose from the shadows, not with his bow, but with his tomahawk in hand, a fearsome silhouette against the moon. But Finch, seeing Kono revealed, scrambled for the rifle dropped by the first thug. He shouldered it, aiming directly at the Comanche warrior. "Kono, look out!" Elspeth screamed. She was too far away. The rifle in her hands was empty. It was all happening in slow motion. But someone else was closer. William. From his vantage point in the loft, he saw the danger. He didn't have time to nock another arrow. He did the only thing he could. Acting on pure instinct, he grabbed a small, heavy wooden block he'd been using to practice his whittling, a skill his father had taught him so long ago. With all his might, he hurled it down. The block wasn't a weapon, but it didn't need to be. It struck Finch's rifle barrel just as he pulled the trigger. The shot went wild, burying itself in the dirt. The impact jarred the gun from Finch's hands. That moment of distraction was all Kono needed. He covered the distance between them in 2 powerful strides. There was no mercy in his eyes, only justice. Thorn, seeing his last man fall, threw down his pistol. "I surrender. Don't kill me," he whimpered, his bravado evaporating into pure, pathetic fear. Kono stood over the cowering man, his chest heaving. He looked from Thorn to the cabin, where Elspeth was now emerging, rifle in hand. He looked up at the loft, where the pale face of a boy peered down, a boy who had just saved his life. He lowered his tomahawk. "Death is too quick for him," Kono said, his voice cold. "He will answer to the white man's law, and he will tell them how Thomas Monroe truly died." The hunter's moon shone down on the aftermath, on the silent bodies of hired guns, and the pathetic trembling form of a murderer whose greed had led him to ruin, and on the strange, impossible family that had stood together and fought back. A widow, a boy, and a warrior bound forever by the blood that had been spilled on their land. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the bruised sky in soft shades of pink and grey. The night's violence lay exposed in the pale light. Conno had bound Thorn securely with rope from the barn, his whimpering pleas for mercy met with stony silence. Finch, his nerve completely shattered, had been tied up beside him. Sheriff Bartlett arrived an hour after sunrise, summoned by a neighbour who had heard the gunfire. He rode in with a posse of 2 deputies, his face a mask of grim resignation. He surveyed the scene, the bodies, the bound and terrified murderers, and the trio standing guard on the porch. Elspeth, with her rifle, held loosely at her side, William standing tall with his bow, and Conno a silent, imposing figure, his tomahawk cleaned and returned to his belt. Elspeth, the sheriff, sighed, his gaze taking in the whole impossible picture. "You've had a busy night. Jedediah Thorn murdered my husband, Sheriff," she said, her voice devoid of any emotion, but a cold, hard certainty. He and Finch spooked his horse, drove him over the canyon edge. Conno saw it. Tonight they came to finish the job and silence me and my son. This was not a fight we started. Bartlett looked at Conno, then at the snivelling Thorn. He'd known Jedediah was a snake for years, but he'd never had proof. Now faced with a confession that Finch was already babbling in a desperate attempt to save his own skin, and the undeniable evidence of the assault, the law had no choice. "He's right," Finch cried. It was all Jed. He said the widow would be easy to scare off. He said no one would care about the Indian. The sheriff dismounted and walked over to Thorn. He looked down at the man, his expression one of pure disgust. "You bring a fire to this valley, Jedediah, and now you're going to get burned." He hauled Thorn to his feet. "You'll hang for this, for all of it." As the posse led the prisoners away, the townspeople who had followed at a safe distance began to gather their faces, a mixture of awe, fear, and a dawning, reluctant respect. They stared at Elspeth no longer, just the scandalous widow, but a woman who had defended her home. They stared at William, not a boy, but a young warrior who had fought beside a Comanche. And they stared at Conno, the feared savage who had been an instrument of justice. The whispers would not die overnight, but their tone had irrevocably changed. In the quiet aftermath, as the sun climbed higher, a strange sense of peace settled over the homestead. The threat was gone. The truth was out. Conno walked with Elspeth to the small solitary grave on the hill, overlooking the cabin, marked by a simple wooden cross. "He can rest now," Elspeth said softly, her hand on the weathered wood of the cross. "Thomas, he can finally rest." Conno stood beside her, holding Peppina, who was awake and cooing at the morning sky. A man's spirit cannot rest when there is injustice on his land. You have given him peace. They stood there for a long time, 2 survivors from different worlds, united by loss and a shared struggle. The bargain born of desperation had been fulfilled. The smokehouse was full. William had the skills of a hunter and the heart of a protector. Peppina was healthy and strong, her life a testament to their unlikely bond. "The arrangement is over," Elspeth said, the words feeling strange and hollow in her mouth. "You've done what you promised." Conno looked out over the land, his gaze far-reaching. "My people will move on soon following the buffalo. But the seasons change. The herd will return. I will return." It was not a question, nor was it a promise of romance. It was a statement of fact, a declaration of a bond that could not be easily severed. He looked at her then, at William, who was practicing with his bow in the yard below his movements, now fluid and confident. "He is your son," Kono said, "but he has a Comanche's eye. He will be a great man." Elspeth looked down at Peppina, whose tiny hand reached out and curled around her finger. A deep, aching sadness mingled with her relief. This child had become a part of her, a part of the rhythm of her days. Later that day, Kono packed his small camp. He came to the cabin one last time. He held Peppina out to Elspeth, not for feeding, but for a farewell. Elspeth took the baby, her eyes stinging with tears she refused to let fall. She held the child close, breathing in her sweet, milky scent, and kissed her soft cheek. "Be well, mourning dove," she whispered. She handed her back to Kono. Their hands brushed a brief, warm contact that spoke volumes. Their eyes met, and in that shared gaze was a universe of understanding, of respect, earned through fire and blood. No other words were needed. Elspeth and William stood on the porch and watched as Kono walked away, a tall, proud figure heading west, his daughter held securely against his chest. They watched until he was just a small speck on the vast prairie, disappearing into the haze of the setting sun. The silence that returned to the homestead was different now. It was not the empty, suffocating silence of grief. It was a quiet peace filled with the strength of survival and the promise of a new dawn. They were a family of two once more, but they were not broken. They were forged anew, stronger and more resilient than before, forever changed by the warrior and his daughter, and the impossible bargain of blood and milk that had against all odds saved them all. We've journeyed into the heart of the unforgiving West, a place where survival demanded impossible choices. This wasn't just a story of a widow and a warrior. It was a testament to the human spirit's refusal to be bound by prejudice when faced with the universal needs of a parent's love and a child's hunger. Elspeth and Kono, two souls divided by culture, but united in desperation, forged a bond that rewrote the rules of their world. They remind us that family isn't always about the blood you share, but about the fire you walk through together and the courage you find in the most unexpected of allies. If this story of unlikely courage and the fierce, unyielding power of a parent's heart moved you, please help us share it with others. Hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a powerful story, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more tales from the forgotten corners of history. Your support allows us to keep these stories alive. Thank you for listening.